Colossians chapter 3, verse 18. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Next one, verse 19. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. So this first pairing, the pairing to the wife and then to the husband, at first glance, us in the modern world might think, well, this seems a little outdated. Wives submit to their husbands seems a little outdated. Are we sure? How do we understand it? How do we reconcile this? But I want to talk about how revolutionary this was, actually. I mean, on the one hand, the wife submitting to the husband is pretty common fare in the Roman world. But for husbands to be told to love their wives wouldn't have been common. In fact, there's very little, outside of the New Testament instruction like this in the ancient world. This is pretty interesting. In the ancient Roman world, their system, the lowest common denominator of the culture, is something known as paterfamilias. Paterfamilias is this idea that the head patriarch of the home is pretty much law. He rules. The husbands ruled. And this is everybody in that extended family. Everybody, okay? Husbands owned the property. Wives didn't. Husbands were able to engage in politics. Wives couldn't. It was very much a man's world. Men had almost absolute authority over their children. There was very little a husband could ever be in trouble from the government about what he did inside of that home. He kind of ruled absolutely. And so that's the culture here. And so Paul he's writing to Christians, and I want you to see that the Christian message, honestly, is fairly destabilizing to Rome in its core. And this is a part of the conversation we might not realize is when the Christians are coming into these cities in Rome, they have this idea about what Jesus has done in the world that's transformed everything. And this could be a threat to the Roman order. In fact, I want to show you what do the Christians actually believe about what Jesus has done. Look at Galatians chapter 3. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. But look at this. Hit the next verse. Because of this truth, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ. Now, I'm telling you, that might not seem explosive to us today. That is explosive thought in the first century. The fact that we would make an equivalence between the slaves and the free, between the males and the females, in the early church, the leadership in the early church, friends, is incredibly mutualistic. You have women leaders, you have men leaders, you have slaves that are sometimes in leadership roles over their masters potentially. Because inside the church, we're all one in Christ. There's neither male nor female. There's neither Jew nor Gentile. All the social distinctions, the things that Rome is resting on for social order is kind of being thrown in. Now, why? Why is this what Christians taught? It isn't because they were kind of social justice warriors from the first century. That's a very modern idea. Like, let's give everybody their rights, That's not why Paul wrote that in Galatians. Paul writes this in Galatians because he believes in the larger story. He believes that Jesus comes into human history to correct what happened back in Genesis. This is a part of a larger cosmic story of how God, in the first chapters of the Bible, created humans to both share his image equally. And when God created humans in his image, male and female, he created them in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27 and 28. They are both given this commission to reflect the glory of God equally throughout the entire world. As they share in God's image, as they are mutually given this role to take God's created order into the farthest reaches of all of creation to reflect his glory, that was what was supposed to be the relationship between humans in Genesis 1 and chapter 2. But in Genesis chapter 3, that all changes. And in Genesis chapter 3, after humans fall away from God, after Adam and Eve sin and rebel against God, we now see kind of what happened to the human relationship in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. God is addressing the woman here, And he says to her, he says, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you will give birth to children. Now I want to stop right here. And a lot of times this part of the passage is kind of confusing. Like, what is it that God's actually saying has happened here? And really what this is a connection to what God told Adam and Eve in chapter 1, to be fruitful and to multiply. You see, there's a pairing. Childbearing and giving birth is to be a link to being fruitful and to multiplying. So what he's saying is, now after the sin, after the fall of humanity, the command I gave you is going to be much more difficult. To be fruitful and to multiply is going to be much more difficult on the other side of Eden, after the fall has happened. And now we're going to have this turmoil in that mandate. He goes on, he says in the next part of this, he says, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. See what's happened in the post-fall world is now this pairing, this powerful husband and wife, the two that are supposed to become one, that share mutually in God's image, that share and create this amazing image of God for the rest of the world, are now going to be at odds with each other. And what's supposed to be this beautiful submitting to one another as they follow God has now been ruptured. And now everything associated with the family is now a giant mess. This word desire, it means to want mastery over. In chapter 4 of Genesis, it's the same word when God warns Cain that there's evil crouching at the door and it desires to have him. You better watch it. It's now introduced. What used to be harmony is now strife. And what basically this text is telling us is that now on the other side of the fall, husbands are going to rule over their wives. That wasn't how God designed it. This isn't what God wanted for it. And so what did the early Christians believe? They believed the second Adam came to fix that. Come on, that should be a celebration. They believed the second Adam said, I'm coming into this world full of hierarchies, full of all of these, I'm going to rule over you, and I'm going to design, and all this stuff, and I'm going to come in there and I'm going to teach you guys how to have peace. I'm going to take all that strife and all that rebellion out of your hearts, and I'm going to replace it with submission and joy and love. So friends, that's how you need to be reading these texts in Colossians 3. Because notice, if you guys could go back, I'm going to do a little audible here. Go back to where it says wives submit to the husbands. Look at this. Go back to that Colossians 3. Notice it says in the Lord. See, Paul is going to, he's going to agree with the Roman cultural command, but he's going to give them a different reason for following that command. It's not because that's the law of Rome. It's because you've been giving your heart to Jesus. Now let's move on to the next pairing, the children pairing. This is in chapter 20, verse 20. It says, children, obey your parents in everything. But notice this again, another reason for it. Not because it's the law of Rome, but because this pleases the Lord. So Paul is giving every one of these commands, but he's giving this a distinctly Christian basis. He says here, he says, fathers, don't embitter your children, or they'll become discouraged. In other words, dads, you need to be aware of the role you're playing in your kids' lives. That you can discourage them. You need to be a representative of God's love to them. And if you don't, if you are harsh, if you're mean, if you're ill-tempered, they're going to have a picture of God that is just so distorted. Right? These are the kinds of instructions that you would never hear outside of the Christian realm in Rome. The parents didn't have anyone telling them treat their children the right way. There was none of that. So this is a really unique and radical idea that both husbands and fathers are giving these kind of commands. But let's move on. Let's move on to the last pairing. And the last pairing is slaves. Again, slaves would be a part of the family unit back in these days. And so it says here, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. And do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincere heart or sincerity of heart and reverence. But notice once again, for the Lord. For the Lord. So Paul is addressing the slaves that might be in a home And again, it sounds on the surface just like any Roman kind of thing. You know, slaves need to do what they're told.